On a moonless night in March 1944, a Handley Page Halifax bomber, painted entirely in matted black, flew at 300 feet over occupied France. Its engines throttled back to minimize noise. Navigator peering through darkness, trying to identify ground features that would lead them to a farmer's field somewhere near Lyon. There were no bombs in the aircraft's belly, no formation of other bombers surrounding it for protection, no gunners manning defensive positions that had been removed to save weight. Instead, the Halifax carried 3 French resistance fighters in civilian clothes, sitting nervously in the bomb bay containers of weapons and explosives secured where bombs normally hung, and a radio operator monitoring signals from agents on the ground who were supposed to mark the drop zone with flashlights arranged in a specific pattern. This was Operation Carpetbagger, the secret air war that nobody talked about. Modified bombers flying lone missions deep into occupied territory to deliver the spies, saboteurs, weapons, and supplies that kept resistance movements alive and that would prove essential to D-Day's success. These black aircraft flew some of the war's most dangerous missions, navigating in darkness to pinpoint locations, descending to extreme low altitude, to drop agents who would parachute into enemy territory with false papers and cyanide pills, all while knowing that a single mechanical failure, a moment of bad navigation or unlucky German night fighter would mean death or capture with no hope of rescue. This is the story of the Carpetbaggers and their black bombers, the aircraft and crews that fought the secret war over occupied Europe. To understand why these specialized operations were necessary, you need to understand the nature of resistance warfare and the challenges of supporting underground movements in occupied territory. By 1943, resistance organizations throughout occupied Europe, French Maquis Polish, Home Army, Yugoslav partisans, Italian anti-fascists, and dozens of smaller groups were conducting sabotage intelligence gathering and guerrilla operations against German occupation forces. These resistance movements could tie down German divisions, disrupt communications and transportation, gather intelligence that conventional reconnaissance couldn't obtain, and prepare for Allied invasion by organizing behind enemy lines. But resistance required supplies that couldn't be manufactured locally: weapons, explosives, radio equipment, medical supplies, currency, and specialized equipment for sabotage operations. It also required trained agents who could organize resistance activities, transmit intelligence, and coordinate with Allied commands. Getting these supplies and agents into occupied territory presented enormous challenges. Borders were closed and heavily guarded. Ports were controlled by German forces. Overland infiltration routes existed, but were slow, dangerous, and limited in capacity. The only practical method for large-scale supply of resistance movements was by air, but this created its own problems. Occupied Europe was defended by radar networks, night fighters, anti-aircraft artillery, and searchlight batteries that made conventional bombing raids costly even for massed formations with fighter escort. Flying lone aircraft at night to precise locations deep in occupied territory, landing or dropping supplies in fields that might be compromised, and returning safely was extraordinarily dangerous and required specialized aircraft crews and tactics that didn't exist in 1942. The British began developing these capabilities, first establishing special duty squadrons within RAF Bomber Command, tasked specifically with clandestine operations. The aircraft initially used were Armstrong Whitworth Whitleys and later Handley Page Halifax's 4-engine heavy bombers that were being superseded by more advanced designs for conventional bombing, but that had characteristics useful for special operations. The Halifax was particularly well suited for conversion. It had good range, over 1,800 miles, could carry substantial payload, 13,000 pounds, had relatively gentle handling characteristics that made low-altitude night flying less suicidal than in other bombers, and was available in numbers sufficient to divert some aircraft to special duties without critically impacting the bomber offensive. The modifications that transformed a Halifax bomber into a carpetbagger aircraft were extensive and purposeful. The entire aircraft was painted in matte black paint that absorbed rather than reflected light, making it nearly invisible against night skies. This wasn't the dark green or grey camouflage used on conventional bombers, but flat black applied to every external surface, including the glass of the canopy and navigation dome, which was specially treated to remain transparent while appearing black from outside. Every source of light that might make the aircraft visible, navigation lights, formation lights, even instrument panel lighting, was either removed or fitted with blackout covers. The goal was complete invisibility, an aircraft that could pass within hundreds of feet of German observers without being seen. The defensive armament that made a Halifax a bomber was mostly removed. The dorsal and ventral gun turrets were taken out their positions, fared over with streamlined covers that reduced drag and weight. The tail turret was sometimes retained with a single gunner as minimal defense against night fighters, but often it too was removed since engaging enemy fighters would compromise the mission even if the carpetbagger survived. The logic was brutal but sound. If you were detected and attacked by German night fighters, your chances of survival were minimal regardless of defensive armament, and the weight saved by removing guns and ammunition could be used for cargo or fuel that might actually help complete the mission. The crews flew essentially unarmed, accepting that stealth was their only real defense. The bomb bay was reconfigured to carry containers specifically designed for supply drops. These weren't bombs, but cylindrical metal containers called containers Type C that could hold weapons, ammunition, explosives, radio equipment, clothing, food, medical supplies, or any other material the resistance needed. Each container was about 5 feet long and 1 foot in diameter, weighed around 200 pounds when loaded, and was fitted with parachutes that would deploy automatically when the container was released from the aircraft. The containers were painted in bright colours, different colours indicating different contents so resistance fighters on the ground could identify what they'd received even in darkness. A single Halifax could carry a dozen or more containers, plus personal equipment for agents who were being inserted. For agent drops, the bomb bay was fitted with a special hole literally called the Joe hole, after the British slang for agents through which agents would drop when the aircraft reached the designated location. The agent would sit near the hole during the approach, connected to a static line that would automatically deploy their parachute after they fell clear of the aircraft. When the dispatcher gave the signal, typically a red light changing to green, the agent would roll forward and drop through the hole into the darkness below, hoping the parachute deployed properly, hoping the drop zone below was correct, hoping the reception committee on the ground were resistance fighters and not German security forces. The entire process took seconds, but those seconds represented the transition from relative safety aboard the aircraft to absolute danger on enemy territory. The navigation required for these missions was extraordinarily demanding and represented some of the war's most challenging flying. Unlike conventional bombing raids, where targets were cities or large installations that could be identified from altitude carpetbagger missions, required pinpoint navigation to small fields in rural areas, often with no distinctive landmarks nearby. The navigator had to dead reckon across hundreds of miles of occupied territory, using only compass airspeed and timing, then identify the drop zone from ground features that might be invisible in darkness or obscured by weather. Any error meant dropping supplies or agents in the wrong location, potentially into German hands, or areas where they couldn't be recovered. The tactics evolved to address these challenges. Missions were typically flown on moonlit nights, not full moon, which would make the aircraft too visible, but quarter or half moon that provided enough illumination for ground navigation while still offering darkness for concealment. The aircraft would cross into occupied territory at medium altitude, around 10,000 feet to avoid light anti-aircraft fire, but below the altitude, where heavy flak was concentrated, and where German night fighters typically patrolled. As they approached the drop zone, they would descend to extremely low altitude, typically 400 to 800 feet flying just above the terrain, while the navigator tried to identify landmarks and the pilot maintained precise altitude and airspeed. The drop zone identification system used pre-arranged signals between the aircraft and the ground reception committee. The resistance fighters on the ground would mark the drop zone with flashlights or torches arranged in specific patterns, typically a straight line or triangle, that could be seen from the air, but that were pointed upward rather than horizontally, making them invisible to German observers unless they were directly overhead. The pilot would circle the area, verifying the signal pattern and ensuring no German troops were visible, then make the drop run at precise altitude and speed typically 600 feet at 140 mph to ensure the containers or agents landed in the designated area. The margin for error was minimal too high, and the supplies would scatter across miles too low, and the parachutes wouldn't deploy properly too fast, and accuracy suffered too slow, and the aircraft might stall. The dangers these crews faced were constant and varied. German radar could detect the aircraft crossing the coast, triggering night fighter scrambles that would hunt them across occupied territory. Searchlight batteries and anti-aircraft guns protected key areas and could engage aircraft that were spotted or tracked by radar. The low-altitude flying required for drops meant that any mechanical failure or navigation error could result in controlled flight into terrain, flying into mountains, towers, or trees in darkness with minimal altitude for recovery. Weather was treacherous with fog icing and storms appearing without warning and making navigation nearly impossible. And even successful missions faced danger on the return flight when fuel might be critically low. Weather might have deteriorated at the home base, and the crew was exhausted from hours of intense concentration. The risks for the agents being dropped were even more severe. Parachuting at night into enemy territory meant accepting that you might land in trees, water, or rough terrain, and be injured before you even began your mission. The reception committee might have been compromised by German security forces, meaning you could be arrested immediately upon landing. Your false identity papers, while carefully prepared, might not withstand detailed scrutiny. You were carrying incriminating equipment, radio, crystals, codes, perhaps weapons that would guarantee execution if discovered. And you knew that if captured, you would likely be tortured for information before being killed, with your only defense being the cyanide pill you carried as a final option if circumstances became unbearable. The equipment provided to agents reflected both the sophistication of Allied intelligence operations and the brutal realities of life undercover in occupied territory. Each agent received a complete set of false identity documents: identity card, ration, books, work permits, travel documents, all perfectly forged and aged to appear used. Clothing was carefully selected to match local styles, with all labels removed and replaced with labels from local manufacturers. Currency was provided in appropriate denominations and from correct dates. Personal items that might seem innocuous, cigarettes, matches, pencils, were all sourced from occupied territory rather than Britain to avoid any detail that might reveal the agent's origin. Radio equipment was miniaturized and disguised to resemble ordinary luggage or commercial items. The specialized equipment also included items designed for survival and escape. Silk maps that could be hidden in clothing seams showed escape routes to neutral territory. Compasses disguised as collar studs or buttons could help with navigation. False compartments in shoes or belts could hide documents or emergency currency. And the infamous L-pill, a capsule containing potassium cyanide, was provided to agents who might choose death over capture and interrogation. The pill was designed to cause death within seconds when bitten, though using it required clear-headed determination at a moment when panic and hope for survival might make the choice nearly impossible. The American carpetbagger operations began later than the British, but eventually eclipsed them in scale. The USAAF's 801st 492nd Bombardment Group, based at Harrington Airfield in England and later at Watton, operated primarily B-24 Liberators that had been similarly modified for clandestine operations. The B-24s offered slightly better range and payload than the Halifax, though pilots found them less forgiving at the low altitudes required for supply drops. American crews brought different perspectives to the missions. Many were volunteers who chose special operations over conventional bombing missions, attracted by the variety, the direct contribution to resistance operations, and the independence of flying solo missions rather than in massive formations. The operational tempo of carpetbagger missions increased dramatically as D-Day approached in spring 1944. The Allied command recognized that successful invasion would require maximum disruption of German communications and transportation behind the front lines, and resistance forces were essential to achieving this disruption. In the months before D-Day, hundreds of sorties delivered thousands of tons of weapons, explosives, and equipment to resistance groups throughout France. Entire armories were dropped: Sten guns, rifles, ammunition grenades, plastic explosives, time fuses, allowing resistance fighters to arm themselves and prepare for the uprising that would be triggered by the invasion signal. The impact of these operations on D-Day and the subsequent campaign in France was substantial and often underappreciated. When the invasion began on June 6, 1944, resistance forces throughout France rose up in coordinated actions that had been planned and supplied through months of carpetbagger operations. Railway lines were sabotaged, cutting German supply and reinforcement routes. Communication cables were cut, forcing German units to use radio communications that Allied intelligence could intercept. Road junctions were ambushed, delaying German reinforcements trying to reach Normandy. In some areas, resistance forces held entire regions, forcing Germans to divert troops from the front to maintain control of rear areas. None of this would have been possible without the weapons and equipment delivered by the Black Bombers that had flown silent missions for months before the invasion. The human cost of carpetbagger operations was significant but difficult to quantify precisely because many missions and their outcomes remained classified for decades after the war. Aircraft losses were substantial. Estimates suggest around 10% of carpetbagger sorties ended with the aircraft being shot down, crashing or failing to return for unknown reasons. These loss rates were comparable to or higher than conventional bombing missions despite the smaller numbers involved. Crews that were shot down or crashed in occupied territory faced grim choices: attempt to evade and escape through resistance networks, surrender to German forces, and become prisoners of war, or be captured by German security forces, who might not distinguish between carpetbagger crews and the spies they delivered, and treat them as unlawful combatants rather than regular military prisoners. For the agents themselves, casualty rates were staggering and reflected the extraordinary danger of resistance work. Estimates suggest that roughly 25% of agents inserted into occupied France were captured by German security forces, with most of those captured being executed after interrogation. The survival rate for radio operators who had to remain in one location long enough to transmit intelligence and who could be tracked by German direction-finding equipment was even lower. Many agents survived only weeks or months before being arrested. Their sacrifice enabled intelligence gathering and resistance coordination that contributed to Allied victory, but the personal cost was terrible, paid by individuals whose names often remained unknown for decades, and whose contribution was officially unacknowledged for reasons of operational security. The specialized training required for carpetbagger crews reflected the unique challenges of their missions. Pilots needed exceptional night flying skills and the ability to navigate at extremely low altitudes in darkness using minimal instruments. Navigators required extraordinary map-reading abilities and the capacity to identify ground features from brief glimpses in limited visibility. Dispatchers, the crew members responsible for dropping agents and containers, needed to judge altitude and timing precisely and to maintain calm when dealing with nervous agents about to parachute into enemy territory. The entire crew needed psychological resilience to repeatedly fly alone over enemy territory, knowing that any mechanical failure or enemy contact would mean isolation and probable death or capture, without the support of formation, flying and fighter escorts that conventional bomber crews relied upon. The technical challenges of night supply drops drove innovations in equipment and procedures. The containers themselves were refined through experience. Early designs sometimes failed to open properly, spilling contents, or causing containers to impact hard enough to damage fragile equipment. Parachute systems were improved to ensure reliable deployment at low altitude, where there was minimal time for malfunctions to be corrected. The marking systems used by ground reception committees were standardized to prevent confusion, and to make verification possible, even in poor visibility. Radio navigation aids were developed that allowed aircraft to home on signals transmitted from the ground, improving accuracy when visual navigation was impossible due to weather or darkness. The carpetbagger operations also required extraordinary coordination between multiple organizations that normally operated independently. RAF and USAF bomber commands provided the aircraft and crews. British Special Operations Executive, SOE, and American Office of Strategic Services, OSS, selected and trained the agents, developed operational plans, and maintained contact with resistance organizations. Intelligence services provided enemy order of battle information and defenses that would affect mission planning. Resistance organizations on the ground provided reception committees, secured drop zones, and distributed the delivered supplies. Weather services provided forecasts that determined whether missions could proceed. Any failure in this coordination chain could compromise missions and cost lives. The legacy of carpetbagger operations extends far beyond their immediate wartime impact. The techniques and procedures developed for dropping agents and supplies behind enemy lines influence post-war special operations and remain relevant to modern military operations. The concept of using modified aircraft for clandestine insertion of personnel and material became standard practice for special operations forces worldwide. The psychological understanding of what it took to conduct these missions, the selection, training, and support of crews and agents who would operate alone in extreme danger, informed the development of special operations as a distinct military capability, rather than just an improvisation for wartime necessity. The aircraft themselves, the Halifaxes and Liberators painted black and stripped of armament, were mostly scrapped after the war or returned to conventional configuration. Few examples were preserved, reflecting both the classified nature of their missions and the general post-war desire to dispose of wartime equipment as quickly as possible. This loss is regrettable for historians who would value the opportunity to examine the specific modifications to understand the physical reality of dropping through the Joe hole into darkness to see the actual equipment used to deliver the agents and supplies that kept resistance alive. The few surviving examples in museums represent invaluable connections to operations that were deliberately kept secret and that remain less well known than the mass bombing campaigns that dominated public attention. The moral complexity of carpetbagger operations deserves acknowledgement. These missions deliberately inserted agents into situations where capture meant torture and execution. They armed resistance movements that would commit acts of violence and sabotage that provoked German reprisals against civilian populations. They operated in a shadow world of deception, betrayal, and brutal pragmatism that was far removed from the romanticized image of warfare that propaganda presented. The agents who parachuted through the Joe hole carried not just weapons and radios, but also the psychological burden of knowing they might be ordered to kill or to sacrifice others for the mission's success. The crews who delivered them carried the burden of knowing they were condemning some of those agents to capture and death, even as they understood the strategic necessity of the missions. Yet the strategic value was undeniable. The resistance movements supplied by carpetbagger operations tied down German divisions that would otherwise have reinforced the Atlantic Wall. The intelligence they provided enabled Allied targeting of critical infrastructure and military installations. The sabotage they conducted disrupted German logistics and communications at critical moments, and the psychological impact on both occupied populations and German forces, knowing that nowhere was truly secure, that resistance could appear anywhere that Allied aircraft could operate with apparent impunity even over occupied territory, contributed to undermining German control and preparing for liberation. The Handley Page Halifax and B-24 Liberator bombers that flew these missions deserve recognition as something more than just bombers that were repurposed for secondary roles. They were the enablers of a parallel war, the secret war of agents and resistance that operated simultaneously with and in support of the conventional military campaign. The black paint that made them invisible represented the nature of their missions operating in darkness, literally and metaphorically, conducting operations that couldn't be acknowledged publicly, but that were essential to Allied strategy. The removal of defensive armament represented acceptance that some missions required vulnerability, that stealth and precision mattered more than firepower, that sometimes the best defense was being invisible and unremarkable rather than bristling with guns. For the crews who flew carpetbagger missions, the experience was profoundly different from conventional bombing operations. They flew alone rather than in formation, navigated to precise locations rather than area targets, delivered people and supplies rather than bombs, and succeeded or failed based on finesse and precision rather than mass and firepower. Many carpetbagger veterans felt that their missions had been more meaningful than conventional bombing. They could see the direct results of their work, knew that the agents and supplies they delivered were directly enabling resistance operations, and felt personal connections to the dangerous missions that individual agents undertook after being dropped. The psychological satisfaction of this direct contribution helped offset the constant danger and the knowledge that they were flying some of the war's most hazardous missions with minimal defensive capability. The black triangle marking that identified some carpetbagger units became a symbol of the secret air war over occupied Europe. It represented the specialized nature of the missions, the elite status of units that flew them, and the connection between conventional military operations and the unconventional warfare conducted by agents and resistance fighters. That symbol painted in black on black aircraft that flew invisible missions over enemy territory captures both the literal and metaphorical darkness of special operations conducted in physical darkness, operating in the moral shadows of deception and violence, serving strategic purposes that couldn't be publicly acknowledged, but that were essential to victory. The story of carpetbagger operations and the black bombers that flew them is ultimately a story about the complexity of modern warfare and the diverse capabilities required to achieve victory. Not every battle was won with bombs and bullets. Some were won with silk parachutes delivering agents in the darkness, with containers of weapons dropped into farmers' fields, with radio transmissions coordinating between London and occupied territory, with sabotage conducted by resistance fighters, armed with weapons delivered by aircraft that arrived silently in the night. The Handley Page Halifax bombers, painted black and stripped of armament, were as essential to Allied victory as the bombers that pounded German cities, perhaps more so, because their missions enabled a form of warfare that the enemy couldn't effectively counter. They were the aircraft that kept resistance alive, that delivered hope and weapons to occupied populations, and that proved that even in total war, there was still room for precision, for individual courage, and for operations conducted in darkness that would help bring Europe back into the light.